quote from Badgett. Where the Australian system more closely resembles the American is in the separation of the judiciary from the legislature and the executive. One driver of the shift in power to the executive was the increasing dominance of political parties, which imposed tight discipline on their parliamentary members. This occurred very early. The period without parliamentary dominance was an aberration, a quirk of the period before the political alignments of the first parliaments had a chance to settle. As early as the 1903 election, Parliament was dominated by three political groups. By 1910, these had coalesced into a two-party structure. The composition of the party groupings had changed since then, but the structure has persisted. This structure underpins an avowedly combative and adversarial approach to politics in Australia. The dominance of the political parties allows party leaders to exercise considerable control, reducing the discretion of individual members. Australia has one of the strongest cultures of party discipline of any Westminster system. This has provided much greater stability for governments, and Badgett described the lower house of the British Parliament as being, and I quote him again, in a state of perpetual potential choice. It would be more difficult to support that notion now, and today in Australia and in Britain, governments tend to be more stable than in the world Badgett was writing about. Another trend that many consider troublesome is that over the past century, the executive branch has increasingly dominated the legislature. As the volume of legislation put before Parliament has increased, the time and resources available to consider legislation has declined. Together with the strength of party discipline, this has led to greater deference to the executive. As a result, the role of the Parliament as a forum of contestability and accountability has been reduced. It is true that the current minority government stands against this trend, but minority government is the exception in our system, not the rule. Other factors, though, have contributed to the strengthening of the executive. The growth in the size and scope of government administration empowers the executive. It is ministers who control the administration, not the Parliament. There's a chicken and egg question here. Did the growing size of government make the executive stronger, or did a stronger executive exploit its position to increase the size and role of government? Suffice to say, it was a bit of both. The executive has become stronger because of greater party discipline, but there are also external factors that increase the size and scope of government. 2 world wars greatly increased the role of government, and after World War II, government expanded further with the growth in the social welfare system. As in other countries, industrialisation led and relied on growth in services such as education, health and transport. The growing weight of legislative business has also played a part in the growing power of the executive. The legislation is usually drafted by the executive, and there is so much of it that the Parliament has less opportunity to give it detailed scrutiny. These changes are important, but we still have a strong and effective system of formal and informal checks and balances that includes the states, the Senate and the public service. Public service barely rates a mention in the Australian Constitution. Its role as the administrative arm of the executive took root in Britain after the Northcote-Trevelyan Report of 1853, which led to the development of an apolitical, professional civil service. But by the time of Federation in Australia, the independent role of the public service was taken for granted. The role of both arms of the executive has continued to evolve, along with the relationship between them. There are well-established checks and balances between the Cabinet, traditionally regarded as the policy arm of the executive, and the public service, the administrative arm. The predominant institutions of the executive arm are departments of state. Their role is to provide impartial professional advice, including strategic advice, to administer programs, and to offer caution to ministers in the face of risky decisions. Within the administrative arm, there are other agencies with various degrees of independence and different accountability mechanisms. For example, the Reserve Bank and the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission have high degrees of independence. Their activities are conducted on an entirely professional basis without being subject to the pressure that inevitably arises in departments under the direct authority of a minister. This relationship between Cabinet and the public service is one of the checks and balances in our system of government, with origins in conventions which predate federation. But a new element has emerged that has muddied the water. The rise since the 1970s of a new sort of public sector employee, the ministerial advisor. The support that leaders of the executive branch receive from advisors varies from country to country and is the subject of robust debate. In the French system, ministers are supported by a cabinet comprising a majority of highly capable public servants and a minority of political officers. The cabinet system influenced a proposal by the Labor Party in Britain in the late 1960s that ministers be supported by a political staff of up to 4 people. The proposal was not immediately taken up, but the Conservative Party experimented with the idea in the 1970s, and nowadays ministers are supported by special advisors, a practice which continues to stimulate political and academic debate. In Australia, the reformist tendencies of the Whitlam government led to a significant reshaping of ministerial offices. The new arrangements were influenced by the British experiments with partisan advisors. Ministerial officers have increased in number. There were 209 of them by the end of 1974. Their ranks have swelled further since then, with a growing proportion of political appointees compared with advisors whose backgrounds are in the public service. In recent years, though, their numbers have been cut and their remuneration capped. The growing number and role of advisors raises some questions for the functioning of our democracy, as the role of this cadre of officers of the Commonwealth is poorly defined. In a sense, they are an extension of the persona of the minister. They are portrayed by many as a source of contestable advice on public policy. But the mechanisms for holding advisors accountable are murky. Unlike other public sector employees, they are not called before parliamentary committees, nor are they subject to some of the other bodies that oversee public servants. Nonetheless, the government now operates under a formal code of conduct for ministerial staff that is exacting in its guidance. The real issue here is actually best viewed through the prism of ministerial responsibility. The doctrine of ministerial responsibility has contributed to the rise of advisors and lies at the heart of uncertainty about their role. Tradition has it that ministers are answerable for all actions taken by the departments under their control. But the size and scale of modern government, which I referred to earlier, makes this impossible. Do we really think ministers can be responsible for every significant transaction and all manner of decisions in every part of a complex public service? And it is hardly more plausible that even with a bevy of advisors, they could overcome this problem. In seeking to track so many matters through advisors, it is possible that ministers find themselves accepting a very broad view of ministerial responsibility, a view at odds with the reach of all the other mechanisms established by the Parliament to hold the administration accountable. We must strive for the right balance in the exercise of executive power and clarify ministerial responsibility. The greatest source of change in our democracy has been the immense changes in society at large. British sociologist Anthony Giddens has described some of the dilemmas in public policy that reflect and are driving these big social changes. I want to focus on 4 of the dilemmas he identified, and I'd like to add a 5th. The 4 dilemmas identified by Giddens are globalisation, the new individualism, the changing nature of government, and ecological issues. These 4 issues are driving change in society that demand flexible and creative responses from government. Globalisation not only means increasing economic integration, it also refers to the transformation of time and space in our lives thanks to revolutions in communications and transport. The second dilemma, new individualism, is linked to the retreat of tradition and custom, partly a response to globalisation. The first two dilemmas have led to the third dilemma, a change in the role of the nation-state and of national government, which requires governments to find ways to reconcile the divergent claims of special interest groups and an increasingly diverse community. Engaging citizens in policy and service delivery, which is the overarching theme of this conference, is one way that government is addressing this. The fourth dilemma, responding to ecological issues, requires policies that focus on the idea of sustainable development. These four dilemmas are forcing changes in our traditional approaches to government. The fifth dilemma that I would add to Giddens's four dilemmas arises from the changing nature of communications media. In some respects, the changes in the media are deeply troubling, yet they also hold hope for improvement. Competition within the mass media is becoming more intense. Technological changes, the growth of the internet, and the advent of social media are diversifying sources of information, changing the commercial drivers of the mass media, and weakening the implicit subsidy for strong journalism that advertising sometimes provides. Not so long ago, the changes in mass media would have been the end of the story. But today, the change goes beyond the mass media. New technologies are dispersing our channels of communication much more widely, making it much easier for individuals to communicate through the new social media of the internet, such as Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. All these changes occur and are influenced by broader changes in society and the economy, and many of them are connected. The advent of social media is changing political debate by increasing the channels of communication and giving politicians and the public avenues for sidestepping the traditional media and the filtering it applies. Some of this is noisy and ugly, but other features of this change are encouraging. The new media will continue to evolve, strengthened by the national broadband network, and will create new channels of debate. My hope is that a new generation of trusted institutions will provide the means for a new breed of online analysis and commentary, driven by serious contributors to the policy debate who can bypass the mass media and go directly to the sources of information and to their audiences. As for the traditional media, you could call me a health nut, which I'm not really, but I'm depressed by the increasing saturation of traditional news media with high energy, low nutrition debates. One reason for this poor news diet is that commercial pressures are increasing the populist tone of newspapers, the traditional outlet for political debate. In the electronic media, the increasing number and diversity of media outlets intensifies the pressure. Newspapers are declining in importance. The proportion of people buying daily newspapers has been steadily falling for some time, decades, eroding their profits. So for many proprietors, maintaining a newspaper is almost a philanthropic activity, and many newspapers rely increasingly on fringe advertising and cross-subsidies from other activities to survive. News used to come in 24-hour cycles shaped by daily newspapers. Nowadays, the need to feed electronic media has increased the tempo of the news cycle. Journalists and politicians all work harder and faster to keep feeding the beast. This is driving populism and displacing reporting of difficult, longer-term issues. It contributes to the decline of trust in the traditional media that was reported this week in the Essential Research poll. The professionalisation of politics, often inspired by developments in the US, adds to these pressures. Political operatives are becoming more skilled in techniques for appealing quickly to wide and varied audience, but often at the cost of more considered debate. A few weeks ago, a writer in The Economist argued that the changing character of the media was undermining the legitimacy of government. And as an aside, it's interesting that this article was published not in the printed magazine, but in one of the paper's blogs. The writer argued that a key feature of a healthy democracy is that citizens communicate problems to government so that